Good afternoon. Welcome to EduSet Network. Friend, as you know, this week we have organized series of lectures on economics, and the precise topic is fiscal policy and economic stability. Yesterday we saw the different component of fiscal policy. We discussed in detail, and we'll continue with today, and we'll try to understand the fiscal policy in respect to how it could be tackled at present, because there are various countries which they fear of fiscal deficit as the national its impact on the national debt is increasing. So we'll try to understand this aspect, and we'll try to understand the other impact of the fiscal deficit. So on your behalf, I welcome Professor Ashok Sareen. He is Associate Professor of Economics in Delhi University, and has edited one book on fiscal policy, and has contributed a number of articles in different journals. So on your behalf, I welcome him for the lecture on this topic. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, and good afternoon, students. Let me give a brief summary of what we discussed yesterday. We began with what is the meaning of fiscal policy. There we saw that the fiscal policy contains expenditure and the tax policy of the government. And the economic stability we discussed largely in terms of macroeconomic variables like national income and price level. Macroeconomic stability is achieved when actual level of national income is equal to the potential level, that is maximum that can be produced in an economy with the given resources and technology. Deviation between actual level of Y, that is actual level of income, and the potential level of income, which we termed as Y star, that is deviation between Y and Y star, or Y star and Y, gives rise to instability. This deviation occurs when desired level of aggregate expenditure is not equal to the output, not equal to the potential level of output. Basically, either the aggregate demand, which has four components: household consumption, private investment, government expenditure, and net export, which is defined as export minus import. So when sum of these four components, which we call aggregate demand or desired expenditure in an economy, when this desired expenditure is not equal to the potential level of output, it causes instability. It causes instability in terms of either inflationary gap, that is, when aggregate demand is greater than the potential level of income, it gives rise to inflationary gap. When actual level of output is greater than the desired level of expenditure, or when the desired level of expenditure is less than the actual level of output, it is called deflationary gap. When there is a deflationary gap, the unemployment level in the economy increases. So the task of the fiscal policy is to manage the aggregate demand. And this aggregate demand management is done through expenditure and tax policy of the government. Then we had defined various budget surpluses. Budget surplus could be positive. First, we had defined budget surplus as TR, that is the tax revenue of the government, minus G, that is the government expenditure. When TR is greater than G, budget surplus is positive. When TR is less than government expenditure, budget surplus is negative. Our budget is in deficit. If TR is equal to, that is total revenue of the government or tax revenue of the government, is equal to G, that is the government expenditure, it is called balanced budget. Here we noticed that tax revenue depends upon level of income and tax rate. So when Y increases, that is during boom, when national income increases, tax revenue also increases without there being any change in tax rate, and if G is constant. And during depression or recession, when Y is falling or Y is not rising as fast as when during the phase of deceleration of growth, then we find that even with constant T, the tax revenue of the government may fall or may not rise as fast as it was rising earlier. So we made a distinction between structural budget surplus and cyclical budget surplus. The cyclical and structural budget surplus, the distinction between the two is important. The cyclical component of budget can be calculated as change in tax rate or government. The cyclical component of budget surplus can be calculated as BS star, that is budget surplus at the potential level of output, minus BS, that is the budget surplus or actual budget surplus, which is equal to T into, in brackets, Y star minus Y. Then we made a distinction between a primary deficit and fiscal deficit. Primary deficit is fiscal deficit minus interest payment on the government debt. We also made a classification of the total government expenditure into expenditure on revenue account and expenditure on capital account. Government expenditure on revenue account, which we call revenue expenditure, is also known as unplanned expenditure, and the capital expenditure, which is also known as planned expenditure. Planned expenditure or capital expenditure of the government is that expenditure which leads to increase in assets, and unplanned expenditure is the expenditure on the maintenance of the government, which includes interest payment, subsidies, salaries, and other expenses. The problem of the fiscal deficit is the rise in primary deficit, because unplanned expenditure does not yield any return. Ideally speaking, the entire non-planned expenditure of the government should be financed through taxes. Government must not borrow to meet unplanned expenditure, because government's debt will increase at the rate of the interest or the nominal interest which government has to pay on the past debt. Since interest is a part of non-planned expenditure, so non-planned expenditure is bound to rise with time. So it is very important that if debt GDP, that is gross domestic product ratio, should not rise, it is important that the nominal growth rate in GDP should be greater than the nominal interest rate. So the important thing to notice here is that it is not the size of the government deficit, but the quality of the government deficit that is more important. Why government deficit is increasing? Where government is spending money, whether it is spending money on its maintenance or on creating capital assets. Because expenditure on capital assets will add to the productive capacity in the economy, and in the short run it will boost aggregate demand. At the same time, in the medium to long term, it will also increase aggregate supply. So the expenditure on capital account may not yield as much return as the interest government is paying on its borrowing, but it will have a long-term positive effect. Then we also discussed about the two viewpoints on fiscal deficit or active fiscal policy. There is a school of thought which believes that government should not indulge in active fiscal policy in order to restore economic stability, that is, in order to restore equilibrium, macroeconomic equilibrium. It is better to rely on markets rather than government policies. But there is another viewpoint held by another school of thought, which is called Keynesians. They support active fiscal policy to counter the cyclical instability in the economy. We were discussing the various arguments put forth by classicals and monetarists, that is, the opponents of active fiscal policy. They were that increase in fiscal deficit will crowd out the private investment. This will change the composition of GDP in favor of consumption goods, away from investment goods, and then can have a grave implication on growth rate in the medium term. Higher fiscal deficit leads to current account deficit in the balance of payment. Increase in government debt due to expansionary fiscal policy may get counterbalanced by the reduction in private consumption. This argument is based on the concept of Ricardian equivalence, which basically says that as the government deficit increases and government debt increases, citizens of the country, they believe that it is not possible for the government to service the debt, and then they think that the government is bound to raise taxes. In order to pay higher taxes in future, which government they think is likely to impose on them, they start saving more. So they argue that on the one hand, government increases its expenditure, but on the other hand, the household, they reduce their consumption, and hence the aggregate demand in the economy may not rise. So they say that the Keynesian fiscal policy multiplier is not very large. In fact, it is less than 1. Another argument against fiscal deficit is that it leads to high debt GDP ratio, which can potentially be destabilizing for the economy. In nutshell, Keynesian concept of fiscal policy multiplier is challenged by monetarist and new classical. Now, we shall take up each objection or each criticism in detail, and the counter argument put forth by Keynesians. The argument is the argument given by Keynesian is that the government expenditure may not lead to crowding out of private investment because this phenomena will occur only when the economy is at full employment level. When the economy is in deep depression, saving in the economy is more than the investment, the phenomena of crowding out through increase in interest rate will not take place. Because the crowding out takes place when government borrowing leads to increase in interest rate, and increase in interest rate leads to fall in private investment. They argue that during depression, saving is far greater than investment, and hence if government resorts to fiscal deficit, it will not lead to rise in interest rate, and hence crowding out will not occur. In fact, if government expenditure is directed towards creating economic infrastructure that will generate demand and that will encourage the private investment to make more investment. So their argument is that during depression or recession, higher fiscal deficit, instead of crowding out private investment, will crowd in more investment. And second argument is that if the economy is not operating at its potential level, there is no harm in financing the government debt through increasing money supply. That is, government need not borrow from the public to finance its expenditure. Government can borrow from central bank, which we call monetization of government debt. So through monetization of government debt, it is possible to stall or interest rate may not rise. Second, they also contest the argument that higher fiscal deficit or higher government expenditure will change the composition of GDP, that is gross domestic product. They argue that if government expenditure again is directed in creating capital assets, it may not change the composition of GDP. In fact, the composition of GDP may change in favor of more capital goods and can have a positive medium to long term effect on economic growth. The third argument against high fiscal deficit by classicals and monetarists is that it leads to current account deficit in the balance of payment. Now, how fiscal deficit leads to current account deficit in balance of payment? I hope students understand what is balance of payment. Balance of payment in nutshell is a record of total transaction of a country with rest of the world. It has two accounts. One is the current account, another is capital account. In current account, we include import, export and transfer payments, and in capital account we include the transfer of capital, that is the capital coming into our country through either FIs, FDIs, foreign deposits into our country, that comes under capital account. If government is borrowing, government has two sources. One, government can borrow from households or can borrow domestically. For that to happen, if government is to borrow domestically, then the domestic saving has to be greater than investment. Only then government can borrow. If domestic saving is not equal to domestic investment, or if domestic saving is less than domestic investment, let us assume that the domestic saving is equal to domestic investment. So there is no surplus on this account. The only way this borrowing can be financed is borrowing from abroad. That means saving minus investment, that is domestic saving minus domestic investment, has to be equal to government expenditure minus tax revenue of the government plus NX, that is net export. If S minus I is 0, that is if saving is equal to investment and G minus T is negative, that means government expenditure, if G minus T is positive, that means government expenditure is more than its revenue, then NX has to be negative. NX, that is the net export, export minus import, has to be negative. That means import has to be greater than export. Only then we can have a positive balance, positive flow, capital flow, or positive capital account, or we can have a surplus on the capital account. That means if current account is negative, we must have an equal amount of positive in the equal positive amount in the capital account, and that is possible only if we have the inflow of foreign capital that can give rise to debt in foreign currency. So the debt of the government can be in the domestic currency if it borrows from the public, it could be in the foreign currency if it borrows from abroad. Borrowing from abroad or debt in foreign currency has its own pitfalls, because this debt can be repaid only by increasing exports, which may not be easy for a country to do in short to medium term. Therefore, they argue that the fiscal deficit will lead to current account deficit. But the counter argument given by Keynes is this, that high capital account deficit, high current account deficit, that is high CAD, which we call high current account deficit, may not be a bad thing for a country if deficit rises because of the import of the capital goods, and the capital goods will add to the productive capacity in the economy, which will lead to increase in exports later on. Or if positive capital account on the balance of payment is achieved through FDI, that is foreign direct investment, which is of permanent nature, which again adds to the productive capacity in the economy. Now, another argument was the Ricardian equivalence, which I have already explained to you in detail. In fact, I explained this to you last time also. Today I will take up the main criticism of this Ricardian equivalence, which is put forth by Keynesians. The basic contention of Keynesian is that the Ricardian equivalence concept, or the concept of Ricardian equivalence, is not supported by any empirical evidence. Keynesians term it as a dubious doctrine. Even done right, their criticism of this doctrine is as follows. Very few people have the knowledge or inclination to estimate the impact of current government budgets on their lifetime tax liability. People are not as farsighted as is assumed here. They do not calculate the impact of tax change or government expenditure on their lifetime likely impact, lifetime impact on their income. So it is criticized on this account. It is also criticized that it is based on very unrealistic assumptions. For example, this concept assumes that there is a perfect capital market. That means the cost of saving, the cost of debt is properly or accurately done, which is possible only when the capital market is perfect. The second criticism is the ability for individuals to borrow and save whenever they want. That is, if a household thinks that its income is going to fall in future because government is going to raise more taxes to repay its past debt, then it is quite likely that according to this concept, this household will reduce its consumption and save more and will be able to lend this saving in the market. Or when a household thinks that its income is going to increase in future because of fall in tax rate, they will increase their present consumption with the view that they will be able to repay the loan when their income increases because of the fall in taxes. This assumes that they will be in a position to borrow this money from the market to finance their current consumption to be repaid out of the higher future income. That may not be true, because households do face liquidity constraints. If you go to any banker for a loan to finance your present consumption on the basis of your expectation that your income is going to rise in future because the government is going to reduce the taxes, it's very unlikely that you will get any loan from any banker. So this has been criticized on this account also. Another thing is that the government borrows for long term, 20 years, 30 years. So the burden of the government present borrowing may not fall on the present generation, but may fall on the future generation. The assumption that individuals will be willing to save for a future tax increase even though they may not see it in their lifetime is a very unrealistic assumption. Now, another criticism of high fiscal deficit is that it leads to high public debt. On this we have already devoted lots of time, but there are certain points which need to be explained further. It is not the absolute amount of debt that is important. What one has to see in the context of the size of the economy. So it is the debt GDP ratio that is important. The argument against high debt GDP ratio runs like this. High public debt erodes the confidence of the public in government's ability to repay the debt. Hence, they will be willing to hold public debt only if paid high interest rate. That means as the debt of the government rises, public loses its confidence in the ability of the government for the repayment of debt. So the risk of holding government debt goes up, and they would like to be compensated by asking higher rate of interest on this. This will further increase debt GDP ratio and also interest rate. At this stage, public will realize that it is not possible for the government to sustain public expenditure. They expect that the government will increase taxes sooner than later. Therefore, they may start increasing saving to pay higher taxes. Now, high debt won't be a tragedy if it grows more slowly than the sum of inflation and economic growth. As I explained to you earlier, that debt GDP ratio will not increase if the growth rate in GDP is more than the nominal interest rate. Another point that one has to look at is that who is holding government debt. For example, in case of Japan, the debt GDP ratio there is more than 170. But Japan is not facing any debt crisis. The reason is bulk of the debt of Japanese government is being held by Japanese themselves. That means government of Japan owes its debt in terms of yen, not in any other currency. The problem arises when the government debt is not in its own currency but in some foreign currency. So the important thing to sum up, important things to look at is the debt GDP ratio, primary deficit, who holds the government debt, rate of interest on government debt, and growth rate in GDP. So all these factors will have an impact on the sustainability of government debt. Now, there is another viewpoint which says that fiscal policy is very crucial for the stability of the capitalist system itself. What are the dangers that the capitalist system faces? As you know, capitalist economies are driven by markets, and the one outcome of market operation is that it leads to very high income inequality. That is, bulk of the fruit of economic growth or the benefit of economic growth is cornered by a small percentage of population, which leads to high income inequality. Those who benefit from higher growth rate do not have high capacity to consume. Their capacity to consume, or what we call marginal propensity to consume, is lower. Therefore, the aggregate demand in the economy does not increase as fast as the increase in output. There is a fear of gap between aggregate demand and output and aggregate demand. One may argue that this argument does not hold good now because of globalization. A country, if it cannot sell all what it produces, can always export it to other countries. This is what Germany did in 60s, Japan did in 70s and 80s, and China is doing during 90s and now. Their export surplus has gone up. But the point is, export surplus of a huge export surplus of few countries is possible only if there is an import surplus of other countries. This may not lead to a domestic crisis, but it may lead to some kind of an international crisis, in the sense that it will lead to imbalance in the macroeconomic imbalance at the international level. How does fiscal policy solve or avoid this problem? We know that the two important elements of fiscal policy, expenditure and tax policy of the government, both these policies can minimize the bad consequences of high income inequality. That does not mean that government should resort to very high rate of tax, because there is a counter argument that higher taxes will lead to lower aggregate supply, in the sense that acts as a disincentive to work hard. But what is being argued here is that higher percentage of the incremental income can be taken away from top 1 or 2% of the population and can be distributed through its expenditure policy to the bottom 10 to 15% of the population. That means we are not saying that with the existing size of the pie, larger share should go to the bottom from the top. But what we are saying is that by devising an appropriate tax policy, government can take away larger share of the incremental income from top 1 or 2% of the population and can distribute to the bottom 10 to 20% of the population. The government expenditure policy can help in empowering, in creating more human capital among the bottom 5, 10, 15, 20% of the population, which can moderate the income inequality. So fiscal policy is considered to be very important for saving the capitalist system from its bad consequences of income inequality. Now, here there is a debate between Keynesians and monetarists also. There is one viewpoint that instead of following active fiscal policy, it is better that the government follows an active monetary policy. That is the debate between monetary policies versus fiscal policy. Basic argument of the monetarist is that the active fiscal policy will again lead to increase in the size of the government, and for them government is the most inefficient institution and its role should be minimized in the economy. markets are very efficient. As I may explain to you that the monetary policy also impacts the aggregate demand in an indirect way. By easing monetary policy or by increasing money supply, interest rate can be reduced, and the fall in interest rate can lead to increase in investment. So, here the reliance is through indirect way. This is called the transmission effect of monetary policy is through interest rate, whereas the impact of the fiscal policy is direct. So, they believe that the monetary policy is more effective than the fiscal policy. This again it can be very technical, but I may explain here that for monetary policy to be successful, it is important that the demand for money function and the money multiplier should be stable. It will take a bit of time to explain these two concepts. The money multiplier basically is.
Okay. Sorry, sir. Sorry to interrupt you. We have a question.
Yeah.
Question from Mumbai. Yeah. Good afternoon. Please ask your question.
Hello.
Ji.
Yeah, myself from Mumbai.
Yeah. Please ask your question.
If time later you have said something about income equality, so I want to know what is Gini coefficient.
What is
Gini coefficient.
Gini coefficient.
Gini coefficient is a measure, is one of the measures to measure the income inequality. It is if you know the Lorentz curve. I don't know whether the viewer is there with me or not.
Yeah, he's listening.
If you know Lorentz curve, do you know the Lorentz curve?
We can't answer that. You just explain it.
So this is one of the measures of. This is one way to measure the income inequality. Higher Gini coefficient is considered to mean higher income inequality.
Okay. Now I'll continue with.
Yeah. So we were there.
Keynesian context.
In the demand for money and money multiplier is constant. This again has not been proved correct empirically. So the argument between Keynesian and monetarist is how stable is the demand for money function. Monetarists say that the demand for money function is more stable than the aggregate demand function, whereas the monetarists say that the aggregate demand function is unstable. Keynesians say the demand for money function is unstable. But the fact is that it is not that the one policy is superior to other. Both the policies are to be applied during recession and depression in conjunction. There is a need for both the policies to move in tandem. It may be mentioned that monetary policy will not work when there is liquidity trap condition in the economy. Liquidity trap condition is a condition where there is a the economy is in depression, interest rate is very low, the expectation of future rise in interest rate is not there, and hence the demand for money becomes perfectly elastic. So no amount of increase in money supply will have any impact on interest rate. Moreover, the efficacy of monetary policy depends upon how sensitive is investment to change in interest rate. If investment is not very sensitive to change in interest rate, which Keynesians believe that it is not, then reduction or fall in interest rate may not lead to rise in investment. Keynesians believe that to rekindle the animal spirit in the entrepreneurs, it is not enough to reduce interest rate. It is very important to improve the overall economic environment so that the entrepreneurs are willing to invest more, and that is possible if government takes the initiative to increase expenditure and generates demand at the first instance, which will instill confidence among private entrepreneurs, and they will start investing in the economy. So interest rate is one of the factors, but not very significant factor which affects the investment in the economy. Now, students must have read a lot about recent developments in America and Europe. Several European countries are in deep economic crisis, and the reason given there is that these economies have borrowed a lot, their fiscal deficit is very high. That is why they are facing this problem. And similarly, various views were raised, and in fact various doubts were raised in America about its rising fiscal deficit. Basic argument given by fiscal hawks is this, that fiscal policy multiplier in America is less than 1. Fiscal stimulation has not shown any positive result in terms of growth and employment. So this is the basic argument, and they argue that the debt level in USA, government debt level in USA has gone up so very high that it is sitting on volcano. The interest rate will go up, and inflation in America will also go up. That is one of the reasons. Because of this fear, people started putting their money into gold, and gold has risen so very high during the last few years. But the counter argument given by Keynesian is that the value of multiplier depends on the areas government spends its money. For example, in America, bulk of the money which government has spent in the last 4 years has gone to bail out banks or in reduction of income tax to the high income bracket people. Since their marginal propensity to consume is less, and whatever they spend mostly on imported goods, that is why the multiplier is less. Had government spent this money on creating more economic infrastructure, its positive impact would have been widespread and would have increased the growth rate. And the Keynesians also argue that the quantum of fiscal stimulation in America was far less than what was required. Public debt in America is not very alarming. Debt GDP ratio will fall with the increase in growth rate in America. Most of the debt is in domestic currency. America has not to fear about the debt because the debt is in dollar terms. Real interest rate in USA is negative. Despite high public borrowing to the tune of about $5 trillion over the last 4 years, real interest rate in America has remained negative. So the fear of high interest rate is misfounded. It is not correct because there is lots of excess capacity in the economy, and American economy can absorb more money, so there is no fear of inflation or high debt. USA economy is in the liquidity trap zone, hence fear of inflation is misplaced. That is why fiscal cliff was avoided. If you remember that there was lot of debate over fiscal cliff in USA, and at the last moment an agreement was arrived between government and the opposition parties, that is in Republicans, and the fiscal cliff was avoided because it was feared that if government reduces its expenditure and raises the taxes, then the growth rate in America will fall, which will lead to double dip recession. So that is why, that means there is no such fear in short term about debt trap or on inflation in America. Now the problem in Italy is slightly different. Though the Italy's debt GDP ratio is far less than the Japanese debt GDP ratio, but there the debt is in a currency over which the Italian government does not have any control. The debt is either in dollar or in euro, and euro is not controlled by Italy. It is a common currency. So the problem in Italy is that it cannot adopt an independent monetary policy. Monetary policy is important because if government has to increase its expenditure to increase aggregate demand, it can do it by borrowing from the central bank, that is by printing more money, which option is not there with Italy. But we have the successful stories of recent years elsewhere in the world. In Australia, depression was short-lived because of the right amount of stimulation at right areas. In a depressed economy, fiscal deficit is a right remedy. Most of the concerns raised by fiscal hawkish are not supported by facts. In fact, most of the concerns are based on ideological factors. They are not supported by empirical facts. So to sum up, we can say that for maintaining economic stability, particularly when a country is in deep recession, it is absolute necessity for the government to follow a counter-cyclical fiscal policy, a very active fiscal policy, and all the fears which are raised in the literature are not supported by the actual facts. Thank you.
Okay.
Any question which?
Yeah, you were explaining that inflation and depression.
Yeah, inflation, because yesterday there was a question on inflation,
right,
and yesterday the figure.
And how it's, in fact, we want to know how it's calculated, how the whole price index and consumer price index is put together and then calculated.
Yes.
So what is the exact process? Can you briefly explain in 1 minute just?
Thing is that inflation rate yesterday, headline inflation has come down to about 5.96%, which is lowest in the last so many years. That does not mean, because let us understand what is inflation. Inflation is the rate of change in prices. When we say that the inflation has come down, that means the rate of rise in prices has come down. That does not mean that prices have fallen in the absolute term. And in India, what we do is that we have a wholesale price index.
Okay.
This is inflation on the wholesale price index, not on the consumer price index. Consumers are affected more by the retail price and their basket of consumption. The basket on which they can spend their money is different from the basket from which these prices are calculated.
Okay. So, well, friends, with these words we conclude the lecture. I thank all of you for watching the lecture, and on your behalf I thank Dr. Ashok Sarin for giving such an insightful lecture on this very topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.